This is Change the Narrative, the podcast about innovation in work, life, and culture. I'm your host and tour guide, Michael Hernandez. This episode is packed with great information and ideas that you need if you're starting out writing your own first nonfiction book. I'm really excited to speak with my friend and colleague, Dr. Monica Burns. She is an EdTech and curriculum consultant and author of EdTech Essentials, 12 Strategies for Every Classroom in the Age of AI, and former New York City public school teacher. She works with schools and organizations around the world to support pre-K through 20 educators with thoughtful education technology integration. Monica's website, classtechtips.com, and Easy EdTech podcast help educators place tasks before apps by promoting deeper learning with technology. Monica Burns, it is so great to be with you and talk with you again. I know that you were on the first season of my podcast, which is really fantastic. So it's nice to come back. And I was a guest on your podcast as well. So it's great to have this dialogue and this conversation going around education and innovation and education technology and all of these great ideas. So you always inspire me and you always have great ideas. And I'm glad that you're back to talk about authoring books. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. So excited to be here, especially for this topic.
Yeah, great. And so as I count, you have about 4 different books that you have authored, right? Am I counting correctly? Okay. And I have a couple here with me. One of my favorites that inspired my book, Tasks Before Apps for Educators, about how to integrate technology. And then you have a second edition of a book, kind of a similar theme, but a little bit more substantial and detailed. Very, very handy and helpful guides. And as a type of nonfiction writing, guides is kind of like my book as well, how to do something and insights and instructions and case studies. And so maybe you can just kind of start off talking about this latest book, which is a second edition, a revision, and why you wrote it and what's inside.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book, same title as the first edition, EdTech Essentials, but updated a subtitle for 12 strategies for every classroom in the age of AI. And so this book is in kind of extension and then some significant changes from the first edition that came out several years ago. And the goal was really to have a dozen, chapters, a dozen essentials so that an educator could work their way start to finish from the book, right? As I label the chapters at least, or they could bounce around, so if they're really focused in as a group, thinking about one particular area like assessment, like creativity, like generative AI, right? They could focus in on just one chapter. And so the goal with the new edition was to introduce 2 new essentials that really connect back to the big conversation on AI and education. And then the first edition had a bit more space dedicated to distance learning, which was something that was front of mind for so many educators when the book came out. And so I've removed most of that, made some shifts to say like what online learning or hybrid learning might be, since that is more of the terminology we're using now, right? Or more asynchronous. There's definitely parallels, but just the framing of it's a bit different. And then to also, the second big piece is to thread through, the AI connection through all of the chapters. Since even though there is one chapter on generate, one chapter on evaluate, those are the 2 new essentials. The idea being that if you are supporting, students by curating resources, curate being another essential, you might want to go to a chatbot and ask for some out-of-the-box ideas that might inform your decision-making moving forward. So those are the big changes, the new essentials, the shift from distance learning, and the integration of AI really across the book.
Yeah, that's so important to think about books because when I was writing my book, I was trying to think of something that could be maybe more evergreen. And with a book like Education Technology, it's constantly evolving. And so sort of keeping in mind this idea that your book you don't just finish it, you have to keep coming back to it and revising it. So how did you decide to write a book in the first place? Not just this revision, but your very first book. What was the mindset for that?
So it was something that I hadn't investigated fully or thought about, as a goal of mine when I first started this work in education technology. I was doing a lot of speaking, so a lot of professional development. I was at a conference and I didn't really understand this, but it kind of makes sense in hindsight. That's similar to how, a baseball scout might go and sit at high school games, right? And look for people to, offer a scholarship to, or to invite to try out for another team. Acquisition editors at different publishers often do this at events too, right? They're looking for people who are knowledgeable, who are enthusiastic, and who have a bit of, I don't know if like following is the right word, or just energy, or just some potential with their own group of people, almost like a built-in audience. And so I had an editor approach me from a publisher pretty early on in my journey of talking and sharing about education technology. And it was, I don't want to say it was a conversation I was unprepared for, but it wasn't something that was a big goal that I had. As we started those conversations, there were some obvious areas where I was interested in, where there might be gaps in their own, catalog that, that really worked out, well in terms of our decision-making process. And then it kind of became a shift from, all right, this is something I'm interested in. Here is a small enough topic that we could focus, a book on, as opposed to something really massive like education technology. And what does it look like to put that in a format so that it's actionable for educators? And so that's kind of how I started. So I bypassed some of the, I've got an idea, where do I pitch it part of the process, and more was responsive to someone coming with an opportunity. And instead of saying, oh, that's interesting, I'll let you know, like kind of jumping right into it, which is a similar pathway for a bunch of opportunities in my career, kind of more being ready for it when it happened, as opposed to, dismissing something or just not entertaining an idea because I hadn't thought of it first myself.
Yeah, that's great. So I hear that from other authors as well, that putting yourself in the right place, sort of accidentally, being at conferences and speaking and being very visible about this, people are going to find you and approach you. And I'm sort of curious about that process. You said instead of this large topic of education technology, and also I heard you say, looking for a niche and what's missing in the publisher's catalog right now. How did you decide what that first book was going to be about?
Yeah. So when I first partnered with Corwin, actually, we were looking at some subtopics. So we looked at assessment, as one area, as scannable technology. And now, QR codes are so ubiquitous, but at that time it was very novel and wild to think that you'd have to, explain to someone how to scan a QR code when it's become such second nature in our, commercial interactions, not just in a classroom environment. And so that was really what we had looked for at that time, something a bit smaller in terms of word count, and probably about half the size, of EdTech Essentials. And then, as I was going further into the process, I moved over to ASCD, as my publisher. The new book is co-published with or a joint publication with ISTE, because they are together now. And so, as we kind of looked from those earlier pieces then to say tasks before apps, where I wanted something a bit more comprehensive, like someone who was curious about this big topic but needed something actionable. Like I was kind of making that decision to narrow down, for them. What it looked like in tasks before apps was having kind of 3 core areas. And then for EdTech Essentials, saying let's get even a little more bite-sized and put these 10 and then 12 chapters together so that there are multiple entry points. I kind of cast a wide net in terms of content when I'm working with educators, but the big theme is, how can we make EdTech easier? So on some levels, it seems like it's casting a pretty wide net, like all the things for K-12 EdTech, when in reality, my niche is more about simplifying the process. I'm not the best person to go to if you want to have have a robust, conversation or professional development, right, on a new STEM and coding initiative you're bringing into your district. But if you're trying to get some buy-in from staff members who have played around with a few things or who are looking to take something to the next level from more of a curriculum side, like that is my area, right, that I focus more on. So that was some of the kind of the conversations that led to the evolution for the newest book, trying to find what that entry point would be for readers.
That's great that you recognize that in yourself. Like, this is my expertise and this is my thing. Now, is that something you just kind of understood, or was that something that sort of evolved, this concept of what your expertise was going to be? And find your place in it, because so many authors are like, well, someone's already written this book before, or someone's way better at this than I am. What do I have of value? And so I'm curious how you came to that. Was it just sort of like it just happened, or your editor pointed it out to you, or folks that you worked with? How did that evolve?
Yeah, so because I was doing, self-publishing from a blog standpoint, right, before this work happened, with the books, I was already really thinking about my niche and my audience before I had a conversation with a publisher. And I think someone who might, even take a look at like, what are they sharing on Instagram? If they have a newsletter, like, what are the common themes? Like, those things are probably already happening, even if you haven't pointed to it and named it, right, as something really specific. And it might even be asking other people, like, what is the thing that I'm providing here that you're not getting from other people? Like, reply to this email newsletter in one sentence, right? And tell me what it is that makes this useful for you, right? Because I think sometimes we're doing things organically without it being strategic at first. And that's kind of what happened for me with my, idea of trying to make EdTech a bit easier for educators. I was invited, we're talking 12, 13 years ago now, to speak at an event that Apple Education was hosting in New York City. I was a classroom teacher. I was using iPads with students. It was really early on. They asked me to come and just kind of talk about some things that were happening in my classroom. And they were, a little coy with telling me exactly what I was walking into, because they probably thought I would say, nope, not for me. That's not what I do, but I ended up, coming to an event that had several hundred people kind of waiting for me to name some apps, like at the very core, and how I was using them in my classroom. And that's really where, in that moment, like literally walking off of this little stage, people were asking, what's your Twitter handle? What's your blog? Like, where can I follow and read more or get more of this info? And I didn't have any answers for this. This was early 2012. And within a few months, I decided, I can set up a WordPress. Like, I can share some of these things. I see that there is this gap because people are asking for this, to my face in that moment, right, for more information. And so although that was a very specific moment of saying like, oh, like here's a gap in the market, maybe, right? It's not just about noticing, and it's about how can I now frame this? How can I now get this out in the right channels? It was great to have this one-time event with people, but like I didn't collect any email addresses. This was like pre-newsletter conversations. It was strange for me to think someone would follow me on Twitter for tips, because that wasn't really a thing right at the time. But then just trying to say, okay, where are these people? Where do I connect with them? And what can I do to get started that can evolve, eventually down the line?
That's amazing. Okay. And so once you were approached by a publisher to write this book, I want to talk a little bit about the writing process and the timing. You have your niche, you have that feedback of kind of where you're going. And let's talk maybe about the first book, because the other ones are sort of variations on or details of the first book, I believe, at least in my mind. So how long did it take you to write? I know you're very prolific and you're very focused, but how long did it take you to write, and how did you find the time in your busy schedule as a teacher or as a consultant to write?
So I really, I'm a big believer in the amount of time you give for a task is how much time it's going to take. So if you say like, I'm going to spend a year on this, it's going to take you a year. If you're say, I have 6 months to do this, it'll take you 6 months. And so I really would tell someone to try and shorten that timeline as much as is reasonable, and instead of letting something go on forever, because it's going to be just as good or maybe not as great because you have lost focus, along the way. And so for all of the books, I would say I worked with, traditional publisher, and they have their traditional timeline for how things work, how soon they can review something, then the next round of reviews, and then it goes to this, And so my big thing with all of them, particularly because the topic, although I try to frame it in as evergreen as a way as possible, is like definitely evolving. We did a find and replace for Bard to Gemini before the new book went out because it was like right on the edge of that changing, as an example. I very much said, what's the quickest we can do this? Because I am ready to make this happen. You tell me and I'll work backwards from there. Like, what is reasonable? What is when you look at your publishing schedule, what's the soonest? And I tried to work backwards from there just to bring the timeline to be as constricted as possible. And knowing that, I would be able to deliver on that, or like having some level of confidence that that would happen. And so because at that point we'd already had a really nice outline, we had a sense of where things were going, I really like to use a structure or almost like a template for the chapters so that I'm not creating something new every time I'm doing this. I'm setting myself up and I'm setting readers up, for success, right, as they're moving through that process. And so I would say that's kind of where I started with saying, what's your constraints? And then what can I do to move this as long? If I get this to you by this time, will this get this out next year? What do we need to do? And so I like to work with that shorter timeline. I know that's not for everyone, but I find that after I've gone through the planning, I like to really linger and sit on the planning piece. But as soon as I'm ready to execute, I'm good. Let's jump in and do this, right? And so at that point, that becomes more of the execution piece as opposed to the planning, the brainstorming, the thinking ideas through is basically done. I just need to make this happen. And so that's kind of how I operate when working with a publisher. When it comes to carving out time, it's really hard to do, no matter what your kind of work schedule looks like. I find that it's not helpful for me to say I'm going to write for an hour every day. That's just not how my brain works. I find that I go through periods where I have a very, I don't know if verbose or whatever the word might be. I have a very writing heavy 2 or 3 days. And then I'm I need a minute. So it's more about, for me, allowing some room in my schedule so that if I'm having and I don't think this is so much an inspired moment as much as just being in the zone for producing content in that way. Especially at the end of the day, I'm this is gonna take me twice as long. I'm just gonna save it for tomorrow, for most tasks. So for writing, I like to say, I'm in the zone for this. What else can I put off till next week? Or what else can I've already batched all my podcasts. So now, even though I would like to go get some work done ahead of time, I'm going to put that off for a week because I really want to spend 3 hours today doing this. And that way, I'm kind of I find that just to be more productive. And that's a harder thing to plan for. And I have the flexibility of having, I'm full-time outside of the classroom, right? So I'm not full-time with any company. There's a lot of pros and cons for scheduling for that, right? I might feel inspired or moved to write one day, but I've got a full day of professional development with teachers and I'm going to be, fried by the end of the day. So for me, it's more about leaning into those moments, understanding that things that are not high priority, even though I might have wanted to do them today, I can push off, to later in the week or maybe next week.
Okay, I love that. And I think one of the things that I admire about you so much, and we talked about this in the last time you were on the podcast, is your sense of organization. But it's really great to hear you talking about sort of listening to your body and listening to your mind and leaning into those times when it's right. And when it's not, it's not. And I that actually lingers with me. We had this conversation a few months ago and realizing that I want to work at night, but I think you and I are both morning people. And at night, my mind just isn't there. And so it will take longer if I try to force it in that time. And so trying to find the right spot and still having a schedule, I think, not just doing it whenever I feel like it, right? I think that's a mistake a lot of writers make is, well, I'm only going to write when I become inspired. I think it's striking that right balance of knowing when the flow is happening and making space for that, and still having that structure. That's really fantastic. So, okay, so that's really great about that. I'm curious about other tips. You talked about structuring your chapters and having a plan, and also giving yourself enough time to plan and think about it before you hit the ground and do the physical work of writing. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. Like, how much time would you say you spent thinking about and organizing maybe chapter outlines or the structure of the entire book first, maybe some research mixed into that versus writing time? And then what does that mean to have like an outline or a structure for each chapter?
Yeah. So I really like to have some type of structure or template if I'm doing something like EdTech Essentials, which essentially, right, is those 12 chapters. Like, I want to start this way. I want every paragraph to feel this way at the first paragraph of the chapter. I want that next section to be this. I want the next section to be this. And then I've got that fluidity that moves through. Like, if I've got a short story, I don't know where to go, those are going to pop into a sidebar, right? I want to make sure that I have, some list of tools, some list of chatbot prompts, right, for this new book. So I have a sense of what each chapter will have in terms of features. So that's kind of one type of planning piece. And then the other type of planning is that content. And I think it's way better to invest the time early on, so that you're not like, where does this go? Like, or where do I have space for this section? It's more like, I've done that already. Maybe I move some things around later, but I have that working document where, I've got what's going to go in content wise to each chapter. And, this could go in both places, or if I frame it this way, I could pop it here. Or, I mentioned 3 podcast episodes with QR codes. That's like enough for this chapter. I could actually take that one out and pop it down here, because I think it would connect to both of these ideas. So I think that outlining piece, once it starts to get too robust, I think that's when you're like ready to start writing. You might hyperlink your docs and all of that. But one piece of advice I would give to someone during that process is that there's definitely stuff that you're not going to include. So you might have those, maybe 1,000 words, right, in one chapter that just doesn't really work. It doesn't mean it's not good. It just doesn't work there. And either you're going to realize that, an editor's going to realize that. At some point, you're going to have to chop it. And it's really good to have a process for not quite archiving, but just like setting that content aside, because that is something that you probably are passionate about, right? That you think is valuable. It just doesn't fit right there. And maybe you sneak it in somewhere else later into the book, or maybe it just becomes a blog post or a podcast episode or some other piece of content. And for me, that really helps me not, and I think it's very different if you're writing, about characters and different, writing a different kind of literature. But for this type of work, particularly, like, it helps remove some of the emotional, attachment to that. Or like the fact that I feel like I need to fight to include something. Like, do I really need to? Like, this is not going away forever. I could use it for something else, down the line.
Absolutely. That's great advice. Okay, cool. And so it's interesting, like my editor, actually, when I was writing, I think it was more in the layout phase, but I feel like now that I'm hearing you say this about organizing and having sort of a template for chapters, she suggested looking at cookbooks.
Yeah.
Because what we're doing is oftentimes sort of manuals or how-to guides for folks, along with advice and philosophy. And so it's kind of interesting if you think about your book being a cookbook, because there's different ingredients that go into it and steps in the process. And then, of course, the beautiful end result, which is really great. So what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced as a writer organizing and structuring the book?
So I would say keeping just all of the edits organized, particularly for something like this, which has, these 12 chapters, has the intro, or it has has all these sections. The organization piece is always tough for me for documents to documents. Like, I grew up I would like to think that it hasn't been that long, but I grew up with everything on paper for my edits, always, even through my doctoral program, which was not that long ago, but in my master's program specifically, like I was printing out my master's thesis on paper to go through it by hand, because even though that was, I don't know, 15 years ago, not quite 20 years ago. But like at that point, I still had a really hard time wrapping my head around making edits in collaborative documents or even just my own Word documents, right? And so I think that I've evolved a bit in terms of wrapping my head around like digital organizational spaces as a writer, like in longer form, as opposed to printing out, 100 pages of a master's thesis, making changes and then transcribing it, onto the document. At that time, was probably all I could handle. But when it comes to working in digital spaces, there's no just one way to do it. I think it's about finding what's going to make sense for you. Like I really liked to have everything in Google Docs and have everything hyperlinked, with the different chapters. But then we're reaching a part of the process where my editor wants everything in Word doc with track changes, right? So I need to have a plan for that, and for me, that at least with this last book, what I was doing was I was taking that document that they sent, doing all my track changes, saving it to my device, saving it to my Dropbox, kind of using all my old school, did I hit the save button, trauma, as a student myself. And so having a system there that I knew, like, okay, I've dated this document, this is done, don't touch this one again, because I've already put it in this other folder for this space. Like if it says this name on my folder in my Dropbox, do not open it up on my device with that version. Like download it again and then make the changes and replace it. So it's kind of just figuring out what workflow works for you and then adopting that or evolving, for whoever else may be part of that process alongside of you.
Yeah, I felt like that was the hardest part for me, is like with a project so large, because I've written tons of blogs that are like, under 1,000 words.
Right.
But when you get to 40 or 60,000 words, it's easy to lose track. And I have this imaginary image in my head of like one of those crime dramas on TV with like the articles and photographs pinned to this giant bulletin board with red string connecting all of them. Did you do something like that? Did you have like a board like that, or?
So I think, for this particular book, no, but I have done that for larger project planning. And I've done that with other folks who are in our space also, like to have like a planning day or half day together where we get that, sticky note poster paper and just put it all up on the walls, grabbing some markers and trying to say like, this is my plan for this part of my year. Or like, this is an area that I'm focused on, and putting some sticky notes in different places. So I think there's a lot of value for that. For me, particularly with this second edition, because I was doing some changes to existing content, it kind of focused me a little bit differently. But for something that might be a little bit more larger scale, I love doing that with some big sticky poster paper, having it there, snapping some pictures, transcribing some stuff, right? Making decisions on what's going to be next. It's great. I've done that for like course launches and membership launches to say like, when would I need this email to pop out, right? So for other types of planning things, it's been a big part of my process. For book writing, I would say, particularly in the near term, what I've done recently, it's been a little bit different.
Wow. Okay, so I want to shift into sort of the logistics and the mechanics of the business side of things, and that's working with a publisher and an editor. If you wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit. So I know some folks maybe are thinking that they should self-publish because they would keep all the revenue and they're going to do all the work anyway. And so I'm wondering, you've only worked with editors, I believe, with your books. Why would you recommend working with a publisher and an editor versus self-publishing? We'll just kind of start there.
Yeah, I guess everyone's situation is so different. I think there's valid reasons to consider both. For me, I have a pretty big audience already of folks who might purchase a book for me, and that's fantastic. I never saw a book as a way to monetize my existing audience. So for me, thinking about that, however much percent to however much percent difference, that was negligible for me in my decision-making process. For me, working with a publisher was about connecting with new audiences, getting in front of groups I might not be able to on my own or hadn't already, for forging more professional connections, for expanding my network. And so for me, those, outweighed what I might have made on my own by self-publishing, right? The ability to have something that came from an organization that might then get me, right, some work in other channels that I wouldn't have already got was going to make up any difference from self-publishing that book. So although I think there are definitely situations where it is, worthy of consideration, for me, it was really never on the table because I was not doing the book to make any kind of money off of that as a piece of content. For me, it was a way to get in front of other people, to re-engage with others. I've got a pile here. I mean, I run my own little post office here, basically with my click and ship from the USPS. Like I ship out books, especially in high seasons. Like I'm going to the post office this afternoon to drop just one off to someone. But I will get the, print out 15 labels to folks that I've worked with and then send them out a copy of this book as a re-engagement strategy. So for me, I'm coming at it with a pretty specific angle that might not be the same as everyone else. It might be more true of the particular type of text that we both work with, right? And it might not be quite the same for someone who's publishing a piece of literature, when it comes to the ways that they are sharing their work.
So I hear you saying it's more of like a marketing tool for you, for your consulting work and to broaden your audience and find new markets, I think is what I hear you saying.
Yeah. And I would say that although, I think the content, I'm creating the content to serve a specific purpose, right? To have this material out there and available. The distinguishing factor for me in terms of publishing is who's going to get out and see it. All of my people who already follow along know exactly where to go to find the book, right? I'm telling them where to go. I'm sharing with them where to go. So they're getting this thing already. And if you have a massive network, right, for self-publishing and you want your people, and that's who you're focused on first, right, to get your book, that might be the best way to go about it. But for me, I knew I could get this book to them, but I also wanted to get it to more people and have something that I could use, right, to kind of re-engage folks that I've worked with in the past.
Yeah. And so for those of us who don't have a massive audience like you do, I feel like sometimes working with a publisher gives you legitimacy and in the eyes of a lot of people, oh, somebody believed in you and somebody thinks that this is good and it's been vetted, as opposed to just a rando, publishing whatever they want randomly. And for me, I found it also was helpful when I went to ask for blurbs for the book, to say I'm working with this publisher and this is the reach. So I think also thinking about how you can help others through your book. We have case studies and blurbs and things like that also helps people with your visibility. So the larger the audience your publisher has, the more weight, I guess, it would have for people to help you out as well. So you mentioned that some publishers came to you after speaking. What should an author look for when deciding who to work with as far as publishing? Because we know editors are assigned to you from the publisher, so you don't get to always choose who your editor is. But we do get to choose who your publisher is going to be. What are some tips or advice you have on choosing a publisher?
Yeah, I would take a look at their catalog, see who else is there. If you're already in tune, with that network, you might recognize a name or two, or you might know someone who knows someone well enough to give you just a quick intro, who maybe over email or maybe on a call can give you some insight into what that process was like for them, or whether they give a thumbs up or thumbs down, kind of thinking of it as references, right, for making that decision. I would also ask questions about how many titles they're publishing every year, and then get a sense of how much time and energy, they're dedicating to yours. I would ask them about what kind of marketing plan that they have for your book, right, what they're going to guarantee, right, or what the typical type of life cycle looks like. If they struggle to answer questions around certain things like making the most of Amazon or having an SEO friendly title, right, then that might not be the might be the best choice, right? Because that person is not really in tune with particular trends that are happening, right, within the industry. So those are all things that I would consider, as you're vetting someone that you're going to work with.
Okay, that's great advice. All right, so contracts. So there's a million different ways, a lot of different parts to contracts. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what we should think about in the contract? Because there's things like advances and who owns the copyright to your content, right of first refusal, which means that if you're going to write another book, if it's in your contract, you have to go back to your existing publisher and they have the first chance at it. And if they decline it, then you can go somewhere else. What are some things that we should be looking for, thinking about when it comes to contracts?
So there are some things that publishers I've found that I've worked with, and there's a few that I've gone through that process with, have a lot of wiggle room with, and then things that they don't have a lot of wiggle room with. And so within our kind of education space, the idea of giving an advance is not something that is typical. So that's not something that they have much room with, right? So it's something that for me is not really on the table kind of in my negotiation, right, or decision-making factor. There's sometimes wiggle room with percentages. That can happen if you've worked with someone in the past and you've been somewhat successful, right, with them, right? They might be able to nudge that up a little bit in terms of your percentage. You could also do something that's scaling that says like for the first this many copies, I get this percentage, but if I hit this milestone, like my percentage goes up. Right. So that's another way to think about negotiating that, especially if they're firm that like we only offer this to new authors. Well, can you do anything like if I hit this number? Same thing goes with ebooks. Ebooks don't take the same amount of, print resources, storage resources, overhead costs. Sometimes that's an area that you can negotiate to say like, what is my percentage for ebooks as opposed to, the print publications. Right of first refusal, as you said, is usually pretty easy for people to say yes to, and is something that might not seem important in the moment, but you'll be happy that you have if you need it. Same thing with copyright. That can be a little tricky with different publishers because you're basically giving them like full distribution rights, which basically is almost the same as like having, full copyright of it, but it's not quite the same, even though they might say that to you. I would still push for it because then it gives you some flexibility if they want to use some of your content in different ways, like they might not have permission to distribute it in other ways than the print publication, right, is the exclusive way that they're doing it for your print or ebook, right? So that's something I would consider taking a peek at. One thing that I often try to negotiate is authors' copies of a book, because although you'll often get a discount for purchasing, you might put a provision in for permission to resell. Also, it's really nice and it can add up quickly to get your hands on a lot of copies of your book. And that way, just like I mentioned, you can send it out to people, right? That might not seem like a big deal when you're jumping from like, can I have 15 to can I have 50? But that's a couple grand potentially, like as you're jumping up, right, in the scale of how many books you're actually going to purchase and send out to people. So those are big areas that I would think about. I think it can be intimidating for someone who like really wants to do this and would do it for free anyway, right? Like I feel that way sometimes about different engagements because you feel like, oh, if I push this, I might lose this. But if you're already at that point in the process, I think as long as you're coming from it of a place of kindness and willingness to work with someone, then they understand, that, they can say no and you can say, okay, and then you move forward, right? So those are things that I would put on the checklist of, ask fors, as you're having those conversations.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like the main thing to take away from all this is like things are negotiable, and you should be confident in going in and saying let's talk about it. And it doesn't have to be just the initial contract that they send you.
Right.
That's really great. Okay, so one other big piece that you started to mention was marketing, and a lot of folks we talk to are like, I feel like my publisher didn't do any marketing. I had to do everything. And I feel like that's the case in pretty much every situation.
Yes.
So maybe can you talk a little bit about your marketing strategies, because you're so good at all of this stuff, both before you publish the book, during and while you're in the process, and then afterwards?
Yeah. So, I mean, everyone who I've ever talked to, and I'm guilty of this too, always feels like their publisher is not doing enough, right, for their book, because it's their book and they want more to happen for it, right? So, that's always going to be something that comes up. And I would say when you're having those conversations, the more proactive you can be, the more you can remind people of you and what you're doing, and how they can be helpful, the better. Just like anything, you want to make it easy for everyone to participate in sharing your book. So if you've made graphics, why not just send them to that person, right? And who's at the publishing house? Why not write some tweets that you're going to send them over? If anything, though, they won't share them, right? They won't use them. It'll take in you a copy and paste, a little bit of extra time, but it'll be a reminder to them that you exist, right? And that you're going to keep sending these emails, to them too. So I would say ask for what you can for them, be on their radar, and try and make it easy for them to work with you. And that can make a big difference. When it comes to your own thing, start early. You don't even need to have a title or a picture of your book. Just start telling people that this is happening, whether that is people you're talking to in an event, people, a reminder at the start and end of your podcast. On your blog posts, put a landing page on your blog that just says, coming soon, that you can redirect. I've also done, pages that are opt-in or lead magnets to say, like, I'll tell you, you'll be the first to know, and someone might put their email in there just to, again, kind of have that extra confirmation that people are interested and excited. Before a launch, I've reached out to people who are in my network to say, right, hey, can I give you a watermarked copy of this book? And would you be able to write that blurb, right? And then I might ask them, hey, could you copy and paste this into the Amazon, link when it goes live, right? And again, giving people links, trying to make it really easy for them. For this last book, I reached out to people who are on my list and said, do you want to be a VIP? I'll give you early access. I gave an expiring link, Dropbox link, to the book so they could only see it. I disabled downloads, right? And said, if you fill out this form, you're committing to do this. And not everyone did it, but a good amount of people did it. Maybe I had 100 people fill that out and 25 people left Amazon reviews. I'm pretty happy with that, right? And for those people who did, I sent them bookmarks. I did others, I tried to make it really worth, their while for participating afterwards, just to kind of give a lot of thanks for that. I also did a pre-order bonus for the book. I did an early bonus. I'll probably do another one, halfway through this school year, as we're, approaching into the spring or even into the summer, kind of just, I've got this Google Docs, Google Drive folder full of extras. Let's try this again. If you buy the book, if you forward me your receipt, if you fill out this form, and I take your word for it, here's those extras, right? So trying to do all of that to let people know about it ahead of time, make it easy for people to share. Those are all things that have been, successful for me.
That's great. So you mentioned bookmarks and sending copies to folks in advance, but I like the fact that not everything has to cost money. You don't have to ship things. Just having that Dropbox full of extras would be things like discussion questions for a book study, or a worksheet that you create in Canva or something like that.
Exactly.
It's a great, helpful tool. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned having the long tail before and after the book. I feel like once I publish, people are like, what, it's not out already? Because I've been talking about it for so long and it took me so long to write it. Which I don't know, is that good or bad? But it's definitely out there and people are already talking about it. So and the same thing, you don't have to have the cover art because that comes a little bit later in the process to do it. And to just, for me, it was also helpful to put a stake in the ground and say, I am writing this, and you put it out in public and you gotta finish it. So it's also a great deadline for me as well. All right, so just kind of wrapping things up here, some final thoughts for potential future writers. I first of all want to know, you're so organized and prolific with your writing anyway, but I'm curious how the process of writing a book changed you or transformed you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it really made me reflect on just the audience, right? And who it was that was going to sit and read this. It feels a little bit more tangible to imagine someone holding a book than opening up a blog post, right, on their phone. And so I think that really helped me kind of think through that process. It also helped reinforce for me, especially because I travel at a lot of events, right, to see people who maybe were given a copy of the book and kind of how they interact with it and go through what jumps out for them. And then other people who have come to me and said, like, I have this book, it was really helpful, right, in these different ways. So it has changed the way I've thought about creating content with, specific educators in mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And so, I mean, you talked a lot about your process and organizing and stuff, but what should new authors be prepared for when they take on this challenge of writing a book?
Gosh, I think understanding that there are a lot of steps in the process is really important. And that there are things that are just out of your control. That could be timeline, right? That could be you having reached everything you were supposed to do by that Friday, but then your editor gets jammed up, right? And so you were hoping to get some feedback in a week or two, but now it's been a month, right? And it's not reflective of your commitment, right? Or your work, but there's just pieces of this process that, for as much as it feels like you're in your own silo, are very much out of your control. So I think that's important for people to remember, is that there's a lot of steps along the way, and to try your best to lean into the changes that might happen, as you're going through the process.
If you had two pieces of advice for aspiring writers, what would that be?
Have a space to jot down ideas, even things that don't feel like they're connected. Have that notes app that's titled, brain dump, right? Use voice to text if that feels better, right? Have a space that you really are dumping ideas, and a process for coming back to it. So that might be setting a calendar, invite for just yourself for every 2 weeks to kind of go through, pull out good stuff, make some action items from that, or let other things kind of sit and percolate. So that would be the first one. And then the second one, I alluded to earlier, which is have a plan for the content you're not using right now. And that could be jumping on video to talk through an idea and then posting it as an Instagram reel, or saving that Google Doc where you copy and paste the discarded content right into a folder for future blog posts. You could use those to promote the book, whether you say it was on the cutting room floor, or it might end up connecting back to another chapter that you can make a connection to.
Great advice. I love that. I'll have to use it next time. Okay, so are you going to write another book?
I don't have anything in the pipeline right now. I've been a really big fan of the quick reference guides from ASCD, which are a little more bite-sized. So I've been thinking through what that might look like, moving forward. But right now, kind of still in spreading the word about the second edition, doubling down on some audio content on the podcast too, but always up for conversation. So I didn't think there would be a second edition of this book, and here there is. So we'll see, what the next year brings.
That's fantastic. All right. Now, people want to follow you and find out more about your work. What's the best way to do that?
So you can find everything at classtechtips.com, and at Class Tech Tips is the blog, the Easy EdTech podcast. My podcast lives there, and the web URL, that Class Tech Tips, is the same as my handle on all the social media platforms too.
Fantastic. And of course, we'll have links to that in the show notes as well. Dr. Monica Burns, this has been a fantastic conversation as usual, packed full of useful information for new and existing writers. And I'm so glad you took the time to share this with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
That was an incredible conversation with Dr. Monica Burns. I know that I learned a lot of ideas, and I hope you did too. If you're interested in more ideas, stick around for the other episodes of this season of Change the Narrative. We'll be speaking with authors from a variety of different industries, as well as editors from publishing houses, so you can get ideas from that perspective as well. And I'm hosting an upcoming webinar about how to author and publish your very first nonfiction book. You can find details in the show notes and at my website, storytellingwithpurpose.com. Until next time, I'm Michael Hernandez.